done. And the Sandy Berger we saw at that time was a man of great indecision. Earnest indecision. He really thought Saddam Hussein was a great problem, but he said we can't figure out a good option on how to deal with this problem. It wasn't that he thought, "What are you guys, you're loonies." On the contrary, he thoroughly sympathized with the thrust of the letter, but couldn't come up with a good policy option to get there. And it was the days of Monica Lewinsky, and it was hard for the administration to take certain kinds of actions without getting waves of criticism.
Who was at that meeting? Do you remember?
I don't remember in detail, but certainly a lot of the signatories of this letter with Sandy Berger.
Was Don Rumsfeld there?
I don't think so. But honestly, my memory is getting old, and so I don't remember exactly who was at the meeting. But it could have been. It could have been.
More from the letter. The policy of containment of Saddam Hussein has been steadily eroding over the past several months. Again, this is 1998. As recent events have demonstrated, we can no longer depend on our partners in the Gulf War coalition to continue to uphold the sanctions or to punish Saddam when he blocks or evades UN inspections. Who are part of the coalition wasn't there anymore, wasn't there with us?
Well, I mean, the big thing that happened in the Clinton administration in around 1997 is that France and Russia basically pulled away from the consensus that had supported the sanctions regime and the overflights up until then. In fact, there was a big crisis at the UN. The administration wanted to put more. It all sounds quite familiar, by the way. I mean, if you think about the current situation with Iran. The Clinton administration wanted to put tougher sanctions on Iraq, and France and Russia said no. And so there was a big schism then at the Security Council in 1997. And France was basically in the position of, it's time to forget all this. Let's normalize relations with Saddam Hussein. We know now that there was a lot of money sloshing around, and that the French wanted to renew their oil deals with Iraq, and that was the position they were in. So it was clear that it was eroding. And again, there's a speech that Sandy Berger gave, I think it was in 1999, saying containment was not going to continue to work for very long. That was the Clinton administration's view as well.
From the letter, our ability to ensure that Saddam Hussein is not producing weapons of mass destruction, therefore, has substantially diminished. Even if full inspections were eventually to resume, which now seems highly unlikely, experience has shown that it is difficult, if not impossible, to monitor Iraq's chemical and biological weapons production. The lengthy period during which the inspectors will have been unable to enter many Iraqi facilities has made it even less likely that they will be able to uncover all of Saddam's secrets. As a result, in the not-too-distant future, we will be unable to determine with any reasonable level of confidence whether Iraq does or does not possess such weapons.
That turned out to be quite true. But, at the time, the Clinton administration had already had its big confrontation with Iraq over whether the inspectors were getting to see everything that they wanted to see. You remember that Saddam Hussein was declaring these presidential palaces, which were vast warehouses, off limits to UN inspectors, and so you had a clash between Richard Butler, who was the head of the UN inspections team at the time, backed by the United States, against Iraq, and ultimately Iraq threw the inspectors out. So now we were in a situation where there were no inspectors in Iraq. And so therefore no monitoring of what Saddam Hussein was doing altogether. I mean, it's a real question as to whether the Clinton administration should have actually taken a policy decision that led to the removal of the inspectors.
At that time in January of 1998, did you have any idea who the Republican candidate would be for president that you could support?
No. I mean, in 98, I don't think we had a clear sense of who it was going to be. It may be that Bush was emerging at that time, but I have to say, quite honestly, I wasn't a big Bush supporter in that period.
Who were you in favor of?
I was in favor of McCain.
As was Bill Kristol at the time.
I don't want to speak for Bill.
But I mean, remember the magazine was, I think, very supportive of him then?
I think the magazine was supportive of the policies that he was supporting. I don't recall whether I don't think it endorsed anybody in the election.
But here we are 9 years later. How do you feel about John McCain today?
Very favorably. I think he's a very courageous man. I think he's a very courageous policymaker.
And had he been president, would he have done this differently, do you think?
I think that any president would have done this differently in terms of how to conduct the intervention. By the way, I think that if people may find this hard to believe, I think if Al Gore had been given the presidency after the 2000 election, it's entirely possible that he also might have gone to war in Iraq, because he was one of the leading hawks. I mean, people forget this now. He was one of the leading Iraq hawks in the Clinton administration. And after September 11th, I mean, I think it was possible. The question would have been, would anyone have gone in with the military philosophy that Don Rumsfeld very strongly believed in, that you should have as few true American troops as possible in any intervention, and then and he was totally opposed to the idea of nation building, so you should pull them out as quickly as you could. I think it required a special philosophy to take that approach rather than, let's say, the Colin Powell approach, which is if you're going to go in, you better go in with twice the number of forces that you need, which I think most people would have been inclined to do. But Rumsfeld had a very different theory.
More from the letter, the Project for the New American Century, January 26, 1998. By the way, anybody still work there?
No, I don't. I mean, most of them have moved on to. There may be somebody in the office, but I know I honestly have lost track of it. But I know that Gary Schmidt, who was the executive director, is now at the American Enterprise Institute.
The letter. Such uncertainty will, by itself, have a seriously destabilizing effect on the entire Middle East. It hardly needs to be added that if Saddam does acquire the capability to deliver weapons of mass destruction, as he is almost certain to do if we continue along the present course, the safety of American troops in the region, of our friends and allies like Israel and the moderate Arab states, and a significant portion of the world's supply of oil will all be put at hazard. You mentioned there in that letter, by the way, who physically wrote the letter?
I don't know who physically wrote it. I had a lot to do with drafting it, but so did many others.
But as we look back now, and the critics of this say, you talk about Israel, moderate Arab states, and the supply of oil. Which one of those was the most important to you at the time?
To me, the issue was the overall threat that Saddam Hussein posed to all of his neighbors in the first instance. After all, we go back to what had happened. He had invaded Kuwait. He had invaded Iran. Even when we had sanctions and overflights of his country, he threatened to invade Kuwait again. I think Saddam was a serial aggressor in the sense that, given the opportunity, he was willing to use his force to invade neighboring states. Whether it would ultimately be Israel, but to me, Israel was not the particular focus of this. It just was one of those countries in the region. He had, as I say, he'd fought 8 years against Iran, and he had invaded Kuwait, and he would invade other moderate Arab countries, and particularly Saudi Arabia, which was on his target list if we had done nothing about his intervention in Kuwait.
Did the Kagans all agree at that time? You and your father and your brother?
The Kagans agree about most things.
Do they?
Sometimes we disagree about which Yankee pitcher should be pitching on a certain day, but other than that, we generally agree.
What would you say in your own life has been instrumental in getting you to think the way you do?
Well, I think it's obviously a combination of things. I think it's being raised by a historian who has studied the whole sweep of human history, and particularly issues of how to preserve the peace against aggressors, starting from the ancient world, and he's written about practically every war in the modern period. I think that had a huge influence on me. And then I think this is true of a lot of people, living through the Carter years was a very formative experience. Going from Carter to Reagan, I think, had a big impact on my feeling that Carter's approach, which was to try to pull back American influence, try to apologize for American power, and not to respond when others attacked us, I think proved a real disaster. And then I think when Reagan came in and said, no, we need to rearm, we need to be strong, we need to be in favor of our ideological principles and not be ashamed of pronouncing them and supporting them. And I think that ultimately led to the end of the Cold War. So I'm sure everyone's influenced by the history they lived through, and I think that probably had a big influence on me.
The last sentence of this paragraph we were talking about from the letter, as you have rightly declared, again, you're writing to Bill Clinton, Mr. President, the security of the world in the first part of the 21st century will be determined largely by how we handle this threat.
That was a quotation from President Clinton.
Well, actually, there's no quote there, but
that was a quotation, yeah. That was what he had said in his speech.
How are we doing so far with what's happened in the early part of the 21st century?
Well, obviously, we're in exactly the kind of peril for a variety of different reasons. I mean, it's a fascinating period that is going to be difficult for historians to untangle, because you have a pre-9/11 mentality. You're living in a world that's pre-9/11, and then you have 9/11, and now you start looking back on the past through the lens of 9/11. we did not know, although I think we should have, and I mean we, the signatories of this letter, did not know that we were engaged in a war on terror. Some people had a better grip on it than others. I didn't know. I wouldn't have described the world in 1998 as being engaged in a war on terror. We were dealing with Iraq, which was a 10-year-old problem. I mean, we'd been dealing with Iraq, obviously, since the first Persian Gulf War, and we were thinking about it in that context. Now we see that the war on terror has sort of subsumed a lot of these other issues. And so now if you say, I think a lot of people say, what does Iraq have to do with the war on terror? And initially, it didn't have a lot to do with the war on terror. I think Saddam had obvious connections with terrorists, but no obvious proof that he was with al-Qaeda, but that wasn't the reason that we intervened against Iraq in the first place. Now, of course, Iraq has become part of the war on terror, and people say that's as a result of our actions, and that's partly true, but that is nevertheless the case.
Back to the letter. Given the magnitude of the threat, the current policy, back in 1998, which depends for its success upon the steadfastness of our coalition partners and upon the cooperation of Saddam Hussein, is dangerously inadequate. The only acceptable strategy is one that eliminates the possibility that Iraq will be able to use or threaten to use weapons of mass destruction. In the near term, this means a willingness to undertake military action as diplomacy is clearly failing. In the long term, it means removing Saddam Hussein and his regime from power. That now needs to become the aim of American foreign policy.
And it did. It sort of became the aim of American foreign policy at the end of the Clinton years, and then it became the aim of the Bush administration after September 11.
How much do you think this letter, these people, I mean, a lot of these people went on to serve George Bush, including Donald Rumsfeld, had to do, I mean, this whole group had to do with pushing the president to go into Iraq, or was the president leading everybody into Iraq?
Well, again, I think go to that list and look at what a diverse group that is. Now, we all know from watching the Scooter Libby trial and everything that Rich Armitage, who signed this letter, wound up working for Colin Powell and at least I don't know what he thought in his own heart, but he supported Powell's opposition to the war. A lot of these people who signed this letter together wound up at odds with each other. And so it's wrong to say that all these officials went in and influenced them, because these officials went in and influenced things in a variety of directions. But overall, I think what happened was much more a result of a new approach to the world after September 11th that I think President Bush adopted. And personally, I believe that he adopted the view that almost anyone in the White House at that time would have adopted. I think that his response was not based on, get me that 1998 letter and let me see what the policy toward Iraq should be, or the fact that my Deputy Secretary of Defense, who I don't see that much, signed that letter, etc. I think that any president in that position would have said what I think most Americans said, which is that we have let down our guard. We have been willing to tolerate risks which we shouldn't have been willing to tolerate. And as we look around the world today, where do we see the great dangers? And one of those dangers was an ongoing problem that everyone had been talking about in the 1990s, which was Iraq. A lot of people seem to be under the misapprehension that Iraq kind of came up out of nowhere, that 5 people said, hey, let's go invade Iraq, completely forgetting that the United States and Iraq had been in a state of confrontation and tension going back all through the 1990s, and particularly since 1996. People forget that Bill Clinton bombed Iraq for 5 days with the intention of destroying what the Clinton administration believed were weapons of mass destruction production facilities. And so this was an ongoing problem that now emerged in a different light after September 11th. And this happens all throughout history. After World War II, people looked at the situation in a completely different way in light of Munich, in light of the actions that were not taken. The United States became very consumed with the need to have its power in every part of the world to make sure that this never happened again. Events like that change our perspective. It doesn't always lead us to make the right decision, but it always changes our perspective.
When we talked in 2003 on your book on Europe, your wife was leaving NATO, coming back to the United States, serving as Vice President Cheney's foreign policy advisor.
Right.
Since then, she's been made the ambassador. And I asked you this then, and I think I've asked you on the call-in shows too,